Traditional equity analysis has a blind spot. It models cash flows, margins, and market share, but it struggles to quantify the actual structure of management until a market shock shatters the firm from the inside out. Investors often price management quality by assessing the charisma or track record of a visionary founder. This approach ignores the underlying architecture of how the firm actually makes decisions. While corporate value creation requires decades of compounding effort, value destruction happens almost instantaneously. A single technological shift can flatten an incumbent overnight. When this happens, a durable competitive advantage is often exposed as a fragile moat. This fragility is a symptom of an organization built on centralized dictation rather than an architecture capable of adapting to transition. Institutions that survive these transitions do so by dismantling the centralized founder vision model. To replace it with distributed frameworks that push decision-making down the chain of command. Subjective impressions of leadership are unreliable for long-term valuation. True management quality reveals itself in a firm's structural architectural moat. Micromanagement represents a systemic failure in authority, a structure that mistakenly equates leadership with rigid domination. This unhealthy system hoards decision-making power at the top without demanding corresponding accountability for the actual outcomes those decisions produce. The financial consequence is structural fragility. When leaders are insulated from the risks of their directives, their choices become arbitrary, eventually eroding shareholder value. Resilient institutions operate under a different theoretical concept: healthy authority. Under healthy authority, leadership acts architecturally. Instead of attempting to control every individual action, executives design and stress test a reliable framework for how decisions are reached. This focus on decision integrity aims to prevent the diffusion of responsibility, creating a framework meant to maintain institutional stability, regardless of which individual executive sits at the top. To build decision integrity, a company must replace arbitrary power dynamics with explicitly defined roles of ownership. This begins by identifying exactly who is consulted for data, separating them from who recommends an action. The framework then maps operational layers, defining who decides and who executes the final operation. Finally, it identifies who is ultimately accountable if execution fails. Hard-coding these roles prevents decision paralysis and eliminates the political maneuvering common in failing corporate structures. Decision integrity transforms hidden power dynamics into a quantifiable system of risk allocation. We can see this applied at scale inside ICICI Bank, a 70-year-old financial institution recently restructured by CEO Sandeep Bakshi. Historically, centralized banking hierarchies struggle with an arrogance of intellect, where directives flow from the top and stifle operational agility at the branch level. Bakshi's structural intervention was to remove arbitrary titles and designations, creating role flexibility across a workforce of 140,000 people. This initiated a shift in risk management. The bank moved the primary burden of risk away from a centralized balance sheet, pushing it directly onto the conduct of the frontline staff. By treating 139,000 customer-facing employees as empowered decision-makers, ICICI forces accountability to the edge of the organization. Because the frontline owns the execution and the risk, the executive board can maintain strategic alignment without micromanaging daily branch operations. ICICI's restructuring proves that dismantling arbitrary hierarchies and explicitly distributing accountability directly increases organizational nimbleness. The ultimate test of decision integrity is hypergrowth. Consider Bajaj Finance, which scaled from a 2,500 crore operation to a 3.3 trillion rupee asset under management behemoth. To manage this level of growth and product complexity, a company must evolve beyond the capacity of a small, visionary team. Under Rajiv Jain, Bajaj implemented a long-range strategy, or LRS, a rigid institutional framework specifically designed to avoid the micromanagement trap. The LRS explicitly involves over 1,000 internal employees in the strategy building process to ensure distributed ownership across every tier of the firm. This framework allows the company to institutionalize specific capability stacks, deploying them across dozens of products and geographies simultaneously. Because the architectural framework governs the daily execution, the executive team can focus on integrating transformative forces, like the India stack or generative AI, rather than fighting operational fires. Bajaj Finance's scale is possible because its architecture explicitly delegates strategy creation, proving that true scale requires institutional frameworks, not individual heroes. Highly successful companies eventually face the incumbent's curse, where they begin listening only to their own internal voice and ignore external market shifts. Healthy authority requires the deliberate construction of objective feedback loops to counter executive overconfidence. Bajaj Finance achieves this by tracking 15,000 individual operational data metrics across the entire company. These metrics serve as disconfirming evidence. They objectively flag operational realities, forcing accountability regardless of the management's narrative. External benchmarking provides another tool to force objective reality into the boardroom. Bajaj explicitly models its strategic framework against Adobe, constantly measuring its internal execution speed against best-in-class global tech standards. Decision integrity is sustained by architecting systems that force leaders to confront objective, disconfirming data rather than relying on past successes. There is a paradox to healthy authority. Rigid, explicit accountability at the top creates the required freedom to experiment at the bottom. We see this decentralized experimentation in the successful retail models of Titan and Dmart. Titan's strategy involves allowing localized teams to run low-scale, profitable units entirely free from central corporate interference. This structure allows the broader institution to test new market propositions and absorb the cost of failure without threatening the core business. True institutional anti-fragility is achieved when frontline units can test the market rapidly because the overarching architecture contains the risk. We can now synthesize these components into a final framework for evaluating the terminal value of scaling enterprises. This chart shows the correlation between authority structures and long-term viability. Companies characterized by centralized control and unaccountable power consistently fall into systemic fragility and value destruction. Conversely, companies that explicitly distribute risk and clearly define decision roles achieve sustained long-term value creation. Management quality reveals itself in the structural allocation of decision rights. In an era of rapid creative destruction, investors must look past the charisma of visionary personalities and price the architecture of decision integrity.